Welcome to Tochi Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. This is the part 2 of the story. I'm happy you're here. Now let's get into the story and enjoy your time here. Amaka stood outside the gate of Edward's new temporary residence in Ikoyi, her hands trembling, but her spirit unshaken. It had been months since the night that changed her life, since he had taken from her something she could never regain. She was thinner now, her skin pale from sleepless nights and tear-soaked prayers, but her eyes burned with resolve. The guards at the gate, recognizing her, hesitated before one of them was sent to check with the boss. Minutes later, they let her in, and she walked through the grand marble walkway with each step feeling heavier than the last. Edward was seated in a sunlit lounge, flipping through a business magazine, as though the world hadn't shifted on its axis. He looked up slowly when she entered, and smirked, his eyes calm, dangerous. "You're brave to show up here," he said coolly. "I came for the truth," Amaka replied. "I need you to confess to what you did that night. Admit it. Not for me, but for yourself. Before it's too late." Edward leaned back, folding the magazine and tossing it aside. "Confess," he echoed, as though the word amused him. "To what? A bitter maid's fairy tale? You think the world would believe you over me?" His voice was sharp, arrogant, unbothered. Amaka stood taller. "I believed in your change, Edward. I believed you were becoming a better man. That night you shattered that." He scoffed. "You're still living in that illusion, aren't you? Let me help you. No one cares. You were a maid. Now you're just another woman who regrets her choices and wants a stage to cry on." The words hit her like cold wind. "I didn't choose that night," she said slowly, each word slicing through her pain. "You did. And one day, truth will catch up with you." He stood and approached her, his tone low and mocking. "Let me give you some advice. Take this pain, bottle it up, and sell it to the next NGO hungry for pity stories. But don't come here expecting me to ruin myself for you." Amaka stared at him, her jaw clenched. "Then God will do it," she said softly, and walked out before her legs betrayed the weight of her heart. As she stepped out of the mansion and back into the Lego seat, Amaka felt numb, not from defeat, but from realization. Edward had no shame, no conscience. He would never confess on his own. She would have to drag the truth out of the shadows, piece by painful piece. She walked down the street with no clear plan, no allies, and no money, but with a fire that refused to go out. She remembered the old Amaka, the girl who survived the slums, who refused the first rich man's offer at 14, who slapped a billionaire at his birthday party. That Amaka still lived inside her, though buried beneath layers of trauma and fear. "He thinks I'm alone," she whispered to herself. But truth doesn't need numbers. It just needs courage. And in that moment, she vowed, if Edward would not bring the truth to the light, then she would carry it, bleeding, broken, and burning, until the whole world could see what he tried to bury. It took less than 48 hours for Edward Kane to weaponize the very system that once praised him for his transformation. The media machine spun into overdrive. On major TV stations, morning show hosts dissected a viral rumor involving a former maid allegedly accusing her ex-boss of assault. Without using her name, they painted a picture of a desperate woman seeking attention. Social media influencers began posting sleek infographics. "Don't let your past be hijacked by bitterness." The hashtags followed. Hashtag justice not jealousy. Hashtag made with a motive. Edward made no official statement, but sent out his attorney to say, "My client has a spotless record and continues to serve the public through philanthropy. This appears to be a malicious attempt to extort a man who turned his life around." Behind those crafted words was the full weight of a billionaire's manipulation. Every outlet that once covered Amaka's story quietly pulled their posts. Even some of the journalists who once showed her kindness no longer returned her calls. Amaka, now sleeping in a dusty back room of an abandoned church, watched the narrative twist like a knife. Her phone was filled with missed calls from unknown numbers, some threatening, some mocking. "Why don't you just get over it?" one message read. "You enjoyed the money and now you want to cry foul," another said. She stared at the screen, eyes dry, soul cracked. She had expected resistance, but not this kind of public betrayal. People she had once fed during her outreach trips now doubted her. The same streets where she handed out relief materials now whispered as she walked by. That's her. The one who wants to take down Edward Kane. She had no money for transport, no lawyer willing to represent her, and no platform left to speak from. Still, she refused to let her voice die. In a borrowed notebook, she began to write every detail: dates, locations, conversations, threats. She didn't know what would come of it, but if the world wouldn't hear her now, someday her words would outlive the lies. Edward's confidence grew with every deflected headline. He called in favors, bribed key media executives, and had one of his aides infiltrate Amaka's last known shelter to gather leverage. His team even approached a struggling online tabloid with a deal: run a fake story that Amaka had a history of mental illness and questionable pasts with multiple men. It ran 2 days later with the headline, "Ex-Maid's Past Exposed, Who Was Really Lying." The article went viral. It featured a blurry image of a woman who wasn't even Amaka, but the damage was done. She tried reaching out to women's groups, but most politely declined or ignored her altogether. "We're focusing on more verifiable cases," one director texted. And just like that, Edward's plan worked. He discredited her without ever setting foot in court. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't erase, was the seed of fury and truth growing silently in the heart of a woman who had nothing left to lose. Determined to fight back, Amaka used the last money she had to meet with a well-known legal advocate in Abuja. The office was pristine, white leather chairs, national awards displayed like badges of honor, and a secretary who looked at her with pity. After a long wait, the lawyer welcomed her in. She told him everything, holding nothing back, even when her voice cracked mid-sentence. He listened quietly, then leaned back and said, "You have a powerful story, Ms. Amaka. But stories don't win cases. Evidence does. Do you have video? Audio? Anything signed?" She opened her bag and placed her journal and timeline on the table. He flipped through it half-heartedly. "This is all circumstantial," he said, setting the pages down. "You're accusing Edward Kane, a man with over 12 senior judges on his payroll. I'd need protection just to walk into court with you. And I have a wife and children." The room went quiet. Amaka sat in stunned silence. Her truth wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. She left the office feeling lighter in the wrong way, as though one more piece of her had been stripped and discarded. Outside, the Abuja sun burned down like it was angry too. She found a park bench and sat there until nightfall. Each time her phone buzzed, she jumped, hoping it was someone willing to help. But they were only notifications of new headlines. Edward Kane to fund Women's Innovation Lab. Business mogul donates to widows in River State. She wanted to scream. How could the world be so blind? That night, she returned to the church building. It was empty except for one elderly caretaker who let her stay. "You look tired," the woman said kindly. "Not just tired," Amaka replied, lying flat on a broken pew. "I'm invisible." She cried herself to sleep again, dreams haunted by a man in a white suit and the echo of disbelief that now followed her like a shadow. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, Edward Kane continued weaving his web. He called judges by first name. He had dinner with commissioners. One of his men leaked a document suggesting Amaka was offered money and refused, which was twisted in two. She wanted more. Lawyers began using her story as a case study in how to manage PR after scandal. Edward even proposed legislation aimed at protecting public figures from slander, an indirect bullet aimed at silencing women like Amaka. And while his empire seemed untouchable, deep beneath the marble floors and golden walls, the cracks were forming. Because truth, like water, seeps through even the thickest walls, and Amaka had just started drilling. The final blow came when Amaka returned from a fruitless visit to a private counselor, only to find her few belongings, Bible, journal, and baby scans, scattered outside the church. The caretaker apologized tearfully. "2 men came while you were out. They said I was housing a criminal. They showed papers I couldn't understand." Amaka dropped to her knees, gathering her soaked pages from the wet floor. "I have nowhere else," she whispered, tears mingling with the rain. "I know," the woman said, holding her hand. "But they said they'd burn the place if you stayed." That night, Amaka sat under a bridge, clutching her bag, her stomach cramping from hunger. Her body ached, but her spirit was quietly sharpening. "So this is how they want to finish me," she thought. But they didn't know her mother's story. They didn't know the girl who had once survived with only groundnuts and prayer. They didn't know that some fires purify rather than destroy. In the days that followed, she wandered Lagos in search of safety. She was turned away from hostels, soup kitchens, and even women's shelters. Her name had become poison, and Edward had made sure of it. "She's a media girl," one woman whispered. "She's dangerous to house." At night, she sometimes slept in bus parks or behind food stalls. On 2 occasions, she was nearly raped by strangers. Still, she clung to her journal and unborn child like armor. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she screamed. But she never gave up. Her body had become frail, but her will was made of steel. She looked at the ultrasound she'd folded into her Bible, whispering, "You're the only truth I have left." Unbeknownst to her, her perseverance was stirring something behind the scenes. 2 former maids from Edward's mansion, who had once been paid to stay silent, heard what he had done to Amaka. They remembered the hands that lingered too long, the threats, the fear. One of them, Bola, worked at a roadside restaurant where Amaka once bought Gary on credit. She saw her one afternoon, hunched in a corner, eating plain bread. Bola recognized her and quietly followed her later that night. When she caught up, she didn't say a word, just held Amaka and cried. "I know what he did," she whispered. "I'm ready to talk." And in that embrace, for the first time in weeks, Amaka felt something that money couldn't buy: solidarity. And from that moment, her fight stopped being a solo war and became a sisterhood of survivors. The call came just after midnight. Amaka had finally fallen asleep under the staircase of a warehouse building when her cheap borrowed phone began to ring. Groggily, she answered, expecting it to be Bola checking in. But the voice on the other end chilled her to her core. It was low, muffled, male, and calm. "You're still talking, Amaka. You really should stop. You don't want to disappear, do you?" Then silence. No breathing. No laughter. Just that single threat hanging in the dark. She didn't sleep again that night. Instead, she sat huddled in the corner, heart thumping, praying that God would keep her alive long enough to deliver justice for herself and the unborn child growing within her. By morning, her eyes were bloodshot, her mouth dry, but her resolve hardened like stone. "They want to scare me," she whispered to herself. "But I've been scared since the night he laid his hands on me. Now, I'm just tired of running." But the threats didn't stop. The next morning, she noticed a black SUV parked down the street near where she usually bought roasted corn. When she moved to another area the next day, she saw it again, different license plate, same make. Sometimes it was men in tinted glasses pretending to buy fuel or ask for directions. Once a man brushed past her and hissed, "You're not untouchable, girl." She barely made it back to the back room of a mechanic's shed where she'd been temporarily allowed to sleep. That night, she wrote a goodbye letter in her journal, just in case. Not one of despair, but of preparation. "If I don't make it," she wrote, "let my baby know I tried. Let someone find this and know I wasn't lying. I fought." She placed it between the pages of her ultrasound printout, wrapped the bundle in a waterproof cloth, and buried it under a loose stone near the back wall. The next day, she carried on, shaking but still walking. She debated going back to the media, but knew Edward had poisoned that well already. They'd twist her desperation into delusion. So instead, she began speaking to people in whispers. A janitor who had once seen Edward argue with a crying maid. A former cook who said, "I used to hear things behind closed doors." None of them were brave enough to testify, but they gave her small confirmations that she wasn't imagining things. Bola remained her closest confidant, slipping her leftover food from the restaurant and sometimes hiding her in the back during patrols. "He'll kill you if you keep going," Bola said one night. Amaka looked at her, exhausted but steady. "Then let him try. Because every time I breathe, I remind him he didn't win. That night, for the first time in weeks, Amaka smiled. But it was a tired smile, one that came from knowing death might come, but silence would never be her master again. Bola wasn't the only one Edward had tried to buy and bury. Word began to spread among a few other women who had once worked in his mansion. Women whose stories never made it to the surface because they were scared, silenced, or simply forgotten. One of them, Igioma, was once a private masseuse who had been paid off after a night she didn't consent to but couldn't afford to fight against. Another, Patience, had fled the country on a scholarship just to escape his grip. When they heard about Amaka, they didn't reach out directly at first. But through Bola, a silent network began to form. Secret meetings in back rooms. Whispered stories at market stalls. Hidden phone calls made only when street noise could drown them out. They weren't lawyers or journalists or activists. Just broken women with fractured pasts who'd finally found a reason to speak. Amaka became their voice, not because she was the loudest, but because she refused to stay quiet even when it nearly cost her life. One evening, the group met in an abandoned warehouse in Surulere. They brought old uniforms, discarded ID cards, pay stubs, texts, and voicemails, little things they had saved, not even knowing why. Amaka sat in the center, barely able to process what was happening. For the first time since the assault, she wasn't alone. These women didn't ask her to prove anything. They didn't question why she didn't scream louder or fight harder. They knew, because they had all been there, in one form or another. "He made me feel like I was dirt," one woman said. "But I see you, and I remember I'm more than that." Amaka broke down crying, not from weakness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, heard, and believed. She didn't need to shout. Their presence screamed for her. Their unity became a silent army. Each woman pledged to help gather intel, track his movement, and most importantly, protect Amaka from further harm. Bola overheard that Edward was growing increasingly frustrated that the girl hadn't vanished yet. "It's like she's growing stronger," he reportedly said. And she was. The more they tried to break her, the more women rose to hold her up. They took turns watching her at night, hiding her when suspicious cars circled. Some even risked using old connections to retrieve sensitive files that had once belonged to Edward's estate. One night, as they huddled in a candlelit room to review everything, Patience whispered, "We were his silence. But she's the noise he can't shut out anymore." And from that moment on, their mission wasn't just to protect Amaka. It was to finish what she started, one truth at a time. The attack almost came too quickly for them to react. Bola had caught wind of it from a former kitchen hand who overheard two of Edward's drivers talking about closing the chapter once and for all. The language was coded, but clear. They were planning to stage it as a robbery gone wrong. Amaka would be alone, unprotected, and disposable. That night, Bola raced to the mechanic's shop, where Amaka had been hiding. "We have to go. Now," she whispered, shaking her awake. The other girls waited outside in a borrowed van, engines low. They didn't carry weapons, just fear and urgency. Amaka didn't ask questions. She packed her journal, her Bible, the ultrasound photo, and a water bottle. As they pulled out of the alley, a black SUV turned into the lane. "Drive," someone screamed. Tires screeched. Horns blared. A chase erupted through the wet, narrow streets of Lagos. But the van had an advantage: local girls who knew every shortcut in the city. They ducked into back roads, spun into a market alley, and abandoned the van behind a food stall. The girls grabbed Amaka and led her on foot through a maze of stalls and courtyards until they reached a back gate into an unmarked compound. Inside, a retired midwife known as Amaka agreed to hide her. "You'll stay here tonight," she said, "but after this, you need to disappear." That night, Amaka couldn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because she realized something terrifying. Edward wasn't just trying to silence her. He wanted her erased completely. He wanted her name forgotten, her pain erased, her child unborn. That realization struck her deeply. "If I die," she whispered to Amaka, "they win." The old woman touched her shoulder. "Then don't die." and don't stop fighting. Women like us, we don't vanish. We multiply. The next day, they got her out of Lagos. With the help of the small sisterhood, Amaka was transported on a cargo truck to a village in Ondo State. She arrived weak, dizzy, and terrified, but alive. Mama K gave her a different name, helped her blend in, and introduced her to a local clinic where she could work in secret. It wasn't much, but it was enough to begin again. At night, she lay on a mat under the stars, whispering prayers over her belly. "You will live," she said softly, hands on her stomach, "and you will know your mother never bowed." She was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for a voice inside her, one that would one day grow into the loudest truth Edward could never deny: blood. Life in Ondo village was quieter, but the silence was not peace, it was survival. Amaka kept her head down and lived under the name Ruth, a quiet housemaid at the local health post. She cleaned the floors, sorted herbs, and slept on a straw mat in the corner of the clinic. Her presence raised no suspicion at first, until a man in dark glasses and city clothes was spotted asking around at the market. "He's asking for a girl with big eyes and a Bible," a teenage seller whispered to Mama K. Fear rippled through Amaka's bones. She knew she couldn't stay long. Edward had cast his net wider than Lagos. His reach had leaked into villages, towns, and now the red-soiled hills of her new home. But this time, she wasn't running blindly. She spent her nights copying everything she knew into 3 different notebooks, burying one beneath the hut, hiding another in the clinic, and carrying the third strapped beneath her wrapper. She no longer trusted memory. She needed records. On a cold evening, she sat behind the clinic, watching the horizon with empty eyes. Her belly was round now. Movement came at night, soft kicks, sometimes strong rolls, as if the child within her could sense the tension. "You want to come into this world so badly," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But the world may not want you." Tears rolled down her cheeks, not just for her baby, but for herself, for the girl who once believed redemption came from kindness. That belief had shattered. She now understood something harsher. Evil doesn't go away just because you hope it will. It must be dragged, exposed, and destroyed. But how do you destroy a man whose roots run so deep in power? How do you beat someone who buys truth, twists law, and buries shame beneath charity? Amaka had no army, no wealth, no public voice. But she had something Edward didn't count on: pain that wouldn't die, and a child that would never lie. Days later, the search intensified. 3 strange men were seen asking for a runaway church girl with a mouth too loud. The women in the village pretended not to know her. They lied for her, hid her, fed her. One night, they smuggled her into a different hut 2 kilometers away. Amaka began sleeping with her back against the wall, holding a small knife under her pillow. Her sleep was restless, filled with dreams of drowning in Edward's mansion, screaming but no one hearing. But still, she woke up each day, still breathing, still waiting. One morning, she wrote in her hidden notebook, "I will not die in silence, and I will not give birth to shame. He may chase me through shadows, but he will never erase my truth, not while I breathe." And with those words, her mission shifted, from merely surviving to preparing the final blow. It happened one morning while Amaka was cleaning a small room in the clinic. Her knees buckled and her head spun. Mama K rushed her to the examination table. After a series of checks, the midwife gave her a quiet smile. "You're stable, but we must be careful. You've carried this child through too much fear. The body remembers." Amaka nodded, tears welling. "I've given him fear as a womb," she whispered. "Then give him courage as a cradle," Mama K replied. It was the first time someone had spoken about the child as a person, not just proof or pain. That night, as she lay on her mat, she spoke to her baby. "Your father took from me," she said softly, her hands on her belly. "But you are mine. You're not his shame. You're my survival." And for the first time, she began to think of the child not just as a secret weapon, but as someone who deserved more than war. But the thought that terrified Edward Kane most was the same one that gave Amaka hope. Blood never lies. No matter how many headlines he bought, how many lies he told, how many bribes he offered, He could never erase DNA. She remembered the time he laughed and said, "Even truth needs a sponsor." But science didn't. She reached out to one of the old maids who had become a contact in the city. "Find me someone," she wrote, "who can take a blood sample, who won't ask questions, who just wants to see a wicked man fall." Weeks passed before she received word. An underground technician in Abaddon was willing. He had worked with NGOs in the past and hated people like Edward. All she had to do was get the sample there. The problem? She was nearly 8 months pregnant, weak, and had no transport. Still, she prepared. Mama Kay helped her collect a sample and seal it properly. A friend of the midwife, a local teacher, agreed to smuggle it in a basket of vegetables being transported to Abaddon. The journey took days, but eventually the technician confirmed it had arrived. She had also sent a small note with it. "If this matches, you'll know what to do." The days that followed were agonizing. She counted seconds, prayed, paced. Every cramp felt like betrayal. Every thunderstorm sounded like an approaching SUV. But still, she waited. Then the call came. The technician's voice was breathless. "It's a match," he whispered. "Your child is his." Amaka dropped to her knees, her entire body trembling. "Thank you," she managed to say. Not because it was over, but because for the first time she held a piece of undeniable truth in her hand. A truth even Edward's billions couldn't bury. The village women gathered around Amaka when they saw her collapse into tears behind the clinic. They didn't need explanations. Their eyes saw the victory even her mouth couldn't articulate. She handed the midwife the tiny recorder she'd hidden in her wrapper, one where the technician confirmed everything. "Keep it," she whispered. "If anything happens to me, let the world hear this." Mama Kay wept quietly, kissed her forehead, and hid the device inside a sealed clay pot buried beneath her hut. Amaka knew the danger would return. Edward wouldn't stop. Not until she was dead or discredited. But this time, she wasn't just a woman with a story. She was a mother with proof. And in that, she found a different kind of power. Not the kind that comes with microphones or cameras, but the quiet, unstoppable strength of truth. She spent the following days preparing. She wrote out everything: names, dates, confessions, threats, locations. She even recorded her own voice reading the entries. The child kicked often now, and she spoke to him constantly. "You're the evidence he can't erase," she told him. "You're the truth growing inside me. When the world sees you, they'll know what he did." She began organizing the documents into a sealed envelope. The women helped her hide it inside a delivery truck, addressed to a retired journalist who had once tried to interview her before being silenced by Edward's men. "She'll know what to do with this," Amaka said. "I don't want glory. I just want him to fall." That night, as rain lashed the village roofs, she stood outside the clinic, her belly round beneath the moonlight. "He took everything from me," she whispered. "But he gave me you, and that was his biggest mistake." In Lagos, Edward's informants began reporting whispers of activity. Someone had sent a sealed package. A known technician was asking too many questions. Edward grew uneasy. He'd faced many enemies, corporate rivals, nosy journalists, but Amaka was different. She didn't seek money, fame, or attention. She had vanished, yes, but not because she gave up. She was planning something, and Edward's worst fear was that she had proof. "Find her," he barked at his men, "before she gives birth, before the world sees that child." But what he didn't know was that the child had already spoken, without a word, in blood, in silence, in the kind of truth money could never rewrite. The weapon he thought he buried was now growing stronger by the day, and Amaka, weak and weary, was ready to deliver more than a baby. She was ready to deliver the collapse of everything he built. The day Amaka received the letter, it came not through an officer or even a messenger, but through a vegetable vendor, an old woman who handed it over silently, eyes shifting nervously. The envelope was gold embossed, sealed with the initials EK. Amaka opened it slowly, her heart sinking even before her eyes registered the content. Inside was a crisp letter from Edward's personal assistant, written with artificial civility. In recognition of the past relationship and in the spirit of peace, Mr. Kane is offering a home, financial settlement, and full relocation for you and your unborn child. You are advised to accept this offer and avoid further public drama. A representative will meet you at the address provided. Beneath it were property documents in her name and a signed check, 10 million naira. Amaka didn't scream. She didn't cry. She folded the documents neatly and slid them back into the envelope. Then she tore the check in half. Later that evening, as she walked behind the clinic with Bola and Ijeoma, she told them about the bribe. They gasped when she mentioned the amount. 10 million. Ijeoma whispered, "That's a life changer." But Amaka shook her head. "It's not about the money. It's about my dignity. If I accept it, I've agreed to silence. I've agreed that what he did never mattered." Her voice was soft but fierce. "This child isn't a secret to be hidden in some new house far away. He is proof. A walking testimony. And no amount of money will bury that. Bola step closer. Then we stand with you. Even if he sends 20 million, we'll burn it together." Amaka smiled for the first time in days, not because she was winning, but because she hadn't lost herself. That night, a second message came, but this time it wasn't money. It was a recording sent through a burner phone, left at the clinic gate. The voice was low and grim. "Edward himself, you're playing a dangerous game, Amaka. You think hiding in villages will save you? Think again. You keep pushing, and next time I won't send money. I'll send fire. You have 1 week." She held the phone in her trembling hands, listening again and again, not out of fear, but to memorize every syllable. "This," she whispered to Bola, "is what he calls power." They sat by candlelight, strategizing, storing everything safely. Amaka didn't cry anymore. Fear had become too familiar. "He wants silence," she said, "but I will give him a cry that will echo through generations. And it will start with the voice of this child." It happened just before dawn. Amaka had just risen for morning prayer when loud banging shattered the air. "Open up. Police." The hut door crashed open as 3 uniformed men and 2 plain-clothed officers barged in. "You're under arrest," one barked. "Forgery, fraud, and attempted extortion." Mama K tried to protest, but she was shoved aside. Amaka was thrown to the ground, her wrists bound with cable ties. "I'm pregnant," she cried. "Please be careful." But they didn't care. She was dragged outside like a criminal, her wrapper tearing, her dignity trailing behind her like dust. The villagers gathered, stunned. "She helps at the clinic," one man said. "She's a victim, not a thief." But the officers ignored them. Edward had done it. He'd finally found a way to put her in chains. The jail was a hell Amaka hadn't imagined. She was thrown into a small concrete cell, with barely enough room to stretch her legs. The stench was unbearable: blood, feces, urine, and mold. She sat in a corner, rocking back and forth, cradling her belly and whispering scriptures. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," her lips moved without pause. When she cried out for help, the guards laughed. "Your type likes attention," one sneered. "Now you'll get plenty." For 3 days, she was denied clean water, proper food, or a medical checkup. Her baby kicked less. Her body weakened. And her spirit began to crack, not because she wanted to give up, but because no one knew where she was. Edward had planned it perfectly. Make her vanish. Let her rot. Then release a quiet statement: "We wish her well, as she seeks the help she clearly needs." But heaven hadn't forgotten her. On the 4th night, a young female officer came on duty, new, inexperienced, but with eyes that still held mercy. She saw Amaka curled up in pain and asked, "Are you the girl in the news?" Amaka nodded slowly. The officer leaned in closer. "My cousin worked in that mansion too," she whispered. "She told me stories. I believe you." That night, the officer returned with food, clean water, and a small bomb. "You have to leave soon," she warned. "They're transferring you tomorrow, somewhere far. After that, it's over." With the help of 2 older women in the cell, Amaka escaped through a broken wall tile the officer had noticed days earlier. By dawn, she was gone, smuggled out in a bread van heading to Ekiti. She was bleeding, weak and shaking, but free. And as the van bounced through potholes and rising sun, Amaka pressed her hands to her belly and whispered, "We're still here. They couldn't bury us." Amaka gave birth in a borrowed room behind a shuttered drugstore in Ekiti, surrounded by the same women Edward had tried to silence. No fancy hospital, no doctors, just a midwife, a prayer, and pain. It was the hardest night of her life. Every contraction reminded her of the trauma. Every scream was a mix of agony and defiance. "Push, Amaka, push," they urged. She clenched her teeth, sweat pouring, body burning. After hours that felt like days, a cry pierced the darkness. It was sharp, loud, unyielding. Her son, her proof, her voice. The women wept, clapping softly. "Chukudi." Mama K whispered, lifting the baby. "God exists." Amaka held him close, tears pouring. "You're the answer he never wanted. You're the truth he cannot silence." The baby looked just like Edward, same brows, same chin, even the same dimple that Edward had once flashed while toasting champagne. The resemblance was undeniable. The women who saw him gasped. "He is the key," one whispered. Amaka held her son tighter. "Then I will protect him with my life." She named him Chukudi. She didn't need validation anymore. The DNA was one thing, but this child, this living, breathing testament, was enough to unravel everything. Edward had underestimated a mother's will, underestimated the child born from the very crime he tried to erase. Now, the seed he planted in evil would blossom into the evidence that would haunt him forever. For the first few days, Amaka didn't sleep. She nursed, prayed, wrote letters, and planned her next move. The journalist in Ibadan had received the DNA results. The proof was in the system. Amaka sent a single voice note. "You don't need my name. Just show them his face. The rest will speak." The journalist agreed, saying only, "It's time." Amaka didn't smile. She didn't dance. She held her son, kissed his forehead, and whispered, "We're going to finish this." What Edward tried to bury had now risen, and not even his billions could buy silence any longer. Blood had spoken, and the world was about to listen. The first days after the birth were a haze of weakness, whispered prayers, and raw emotional weight. Amaka remained hidden in the small village compound in Ekiti, rarely stepping outside except to feel the early morning air while her son slept. Her body was healing, but slowly, and the emotional wounds ran deeper. Every time she looked at Chukudi, a strange blend of love and pain rippled through her. She adored him completely. His eyes, his soft hands, the innocent way he yawned. But each feature was a haunting echo of the man who had hurt her. Still, she reminded herself daily, "This child is not Edward. This child is mine. My blood. My voice." With every coup, every breath, Chukudi reminded her that something beautiful could be born from devastation. And that was what gave her the strength to keep living. During the long days, she continued recording her memories. Quiet audio logs she hid inside a medicine crate, and written letters she tucked behind roof rafters. "Even if something happens to me," she told Mama K, "he must never grow up not knowing the truth, not knowing why I fought." The old midwife nodded solemnly. "You are not just surviving anymore," she said one day as she helped her walk outside with the baby. "You are a root. You've planted truth in soil no one believed in. Now let it grow." The wounds on Amaka's back ached less, her appetite returned, and her laughter, though faint, began to surface again. The women who cared for her took turns rocking the baby, singing soft lullabies while preparing yam porridge or boiling herbs. "This is the child of justice," one of them said. "He will open the graves Edward buried his shame in." Yet, even in this momentary sanctuary, fear loomed like a shadow at dusk. Edward's informants were still active. Twice, strange men came to the village, pretending to be buyers of local palm oil. Bola had warned her that Edward knew she had given birth, but didn't yet know where. "He thinks you've disappeared for good," Bola had said. "But this won't last long. You have to prepare to run again." Amaka looked down at her baby, sleeping peacefully in her arms, and whispered, "I'm tired of running." For the first time, she felt like it was the world's turn to run from what she was about to release. The truth wasn't just alive. It had a face. And now, that face would soon stare back at Edward from screens and headlines he could no longer control. In Lagos, Edward Kane stood in the middle of his office, gripping a whiskey glass so tightly his knuckles turned pale. The walls of his empire still gleamed, polished oak fine art, security guards in tailored suits. But for the first time in years, he felt the structure trembling beneath him. "She's alive," his head of security whispered. "She gave birth. Somewhere in Ekiti, we believe. We don't know who helped her, but the woman has a child." Edward didn't respond for several seconds. He stared at the frozen screen of a paused news broadcast. The headline read, "Anonymous source leaks high-profile DNA match between business tycoon and unknown woman's child." The picture was blurred, the baby's face pixelated. But Edward knew that mouth, that dimple, that jawline. He saw himself in that infant. "That technician," he growled. "Find him. Silence him. Find the baby. End this." But it was too late. The journalist in Ibadan had done her work with quiet precision. She didn't include Amaka's name. Instead, she published anonymous testimonies from multiple women, snippets of official correspondence, payment transfers, and a certified report from a medical lab, one of the most reputable in Nigeria. Her caption was simple: "Truth has no expiry date." The story exploded. Social media ignited with outrage. People began connecting dots: former staff who had mysteriously disappeared, female workers who had received hush funds, and Amaka's earlier interview now resurfacing with new credibility. Hashtags like hashtag Justice for the Maid and hashtag Blood Never Lies trended globally. Edward's legal team scrambled to issue denials, but their silence over the last few months now worked against them. "The timing," his PR director said, "it's surgical. They waited until you were cornered." His wife packed her things and left. No note, no confrontation, just a clean break. Sponsors froze campaigns. Board members resigned publicly. One of his oldest partners from a UK firm texted him directly, "We're done." But the moment that truly broke Edward came during an emergency shareholder meeting. He walked in wearing his usual power suit, expecting some tension. But what greeted him was a room of cold stares and murmurs of "DNA the baby. Your silence has become our liability," one shareholder snapped. "We supported your redemption tour. We gave you trust. Now this." Edward tried to speak, but his voice cracked. "There's no proof that child is mine." The room was silent. Then someone slid a high-resolution image across the table. A baby, with his exact face. "No more lies," the board chairman said. "You're done." When Amaka received the message that the truth had gone public, she was sitting beneath the orange tree beside the clinic, nursing Chikwudi with one arm while writing in her notebook with the other. Mama K approached slowly, holding a torn newspaper. "It's happened," she said quietly. "Your boy's face is everywhere. They matched it. They believe you now." Amaka didn't rush to grab the paper. She continued breastfeeding, her face expressionless. Only after the baby closed his eyes did she reach for the page. She scanned the headlines, the grainy image of her son on the right corner. There was no mention of her name, but that didn't matter. Her voice had finally echoed through the walls built to silence her. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered. "Not for vengeance, but for truth." The tears came slowly, not in sobs, but in silence, just as her pain had lived. Quiet, enduring, and now undeniable. Back in Lagos, the world reeled. Protests formed outside Edward's company gates. Civil society groups that once ignored Amaka now organized under banners of justice. His former aides released statements detailing years of cover-ups. And Edward, now holed up in his mansion with no staff, watched his empire fall brick by brick. When the police came to his gates, he didn't resist. He was too tired, too broken. The moment he saw the cuffs, he laughed bitterly. "It was just a maid," he mumbled. "Just one girl, but one girl was all it took." Because what he never understood was that some voices carry the power of 1,000 when they refuse to die, especially when they carry blood that cannot lie. Amaka remained where she was, refusing all interview requests. She didn't want to be seen. She didn't want applause. She only wanted to raise her son in peace. She returned to her duties at the clinic, sweeping floors and handing out herbs, just as before. Occasionally someone would whisper, "Is that her?" But she never confirmed. Mama Kay knew. The other women knew. That was enough. At night, she sang to Chiquiti under the moonlight. "You were born in fire," she whispered, "but you will live in peace." And as her son wrapped his fingers around hers, Amaka finally allowed herself to believe. The war was ending, not with guns or microphones, but with truth, tears, and a child who bore the face of both her greatest pain and her greatest victory. The once untouchable Kane Holdings was now a crumbling castle of silence. In less than a month after the leaked DNA confirmation, 3 major investment firms had pulled out of multi-billion-naira partnerships. Journalists camped outside the company gates, hounding employees for statements. Former staff who once boasted about working for Edward Kane began scrubbing the name from their profiles. From banking halls to boardrooms, whispers became discussions, and discussions became decisions. Lawsuits followed swiftly, some from former domestic staff, others from business partners who claimed fraud, misrepresentation, or breach of moral conduct. It was as though the world suddenly woke up from a long, hypnotic sleep and saw Edward for what he was, a predator wrapped in philanthropy. His public image collapsed like a house made of paper in a storm. Edward tried to fight it. He hired a new PR firm to spin the story into a misunderstanding. He attempted to bribe the journalist in Ibadan, who not only refused but published a threat. He issued a public statement riddled with vague remorse and legalese. "I deeply regret any actions that may have led to discomfort or misinterpretation in the past." But the public had grown wise to his language. The silence that once shielded him was now a wall closing in. Protesters marched outside his Lekki mansion, holding placards that read, "She was just a maid, but she was human, and truth has no price." Some threw stones, others prayed, but all of them echoed one message: his time was up. Behind those tall walls, Edward Kane began to unravel. He refused to eat for days. The house staff resigned one by one. His wife, already estranged, filed for divorce and took their daughter abroad. The mansion, once filled with the laughter of elite guests and the sound of champagne toasts, now echoed with emptiness and regret. He wandered the hallways like a ghost, replaying Amaka's voice in his head. Not her screams, but her silence. That last night, her eyes, the strength he thought he broke. "I gave her everything," he told himself. Why wasn't that enough? But that was the problem. He still believed it had been about gifts, not guilt. Power, not penitence. And now, the entire world watched as a man who once claimed to own everything lost the only thing he couldn't buy: forgiveness. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Edward didn't flinch. There were no cameras, no red carpets, just 3 plainclothes detectives and a quiet knock on the mansion door. "Mr. Kane," one officer said calmly, "you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, attempted bribery, and unlawful suppression of evidence." The list of charges was long, and growing by the day. Edward nodded once, straightened his collar, and surrendered without a word. As he was led away, his neighbors peeked through curtains, phones filming silently. In that moment, the mighty king of corporate Nigeria became a footnote, another man who fell not because of poverty, but because he believed his money was stronger than someone else's pain. The news spread like wildfire. Local stations broadcasted the footage of his arrest. Former billionaire Edward Kane taken into custody. The headlines read, "Suspected in multiple abuse cover-ups." For the first time, his lawyers refused to stand beside him during a press conference. His bail application was denied after multiple testimonies poured in from former staff, many inspired by Amaka's bravery. Those who had once feared him now found their voices. Their stories weren't identical, but the pattern was clear: manipulation, intimidation, violation, and silence. The media dubbed it the Kane Web, and each day unraveled another thread of corruption, deceit, and darkness. The name Edward Kane no longer commanded respect. It commanded disgust. Back in the village, Amaka heard the news from a transistor radio. She was washing Chikwuti's clothes beside the stream when Mama Kay arrived breathless. "They got him," she said, holding the radio like it was gold. Amaka sat in silence, letting the words sink in. She didn't cheer. She didn't dance. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." Not to the police, not to the journalist, but to God and to herself for not giving up. She looked at her son, giggling in his makeshift crib made of raffia and cloth. "Your father is no longer a king," she murmured. "But you are still light." That night, she lit a candle and placed it by her bedside. Not for vengeance, but for closure. Edward Kane had fallen, but she was still rising. Amaka stepped off the bus in the early hours of dawn, holding Chikwooti against her chest with one hand and a plastic bag with all their belongings in the other. The city hadn't changed. Lagos was still buzzing, loud, and chaotic, but the way it looked at her had. She wasn't the invisible maid who cleaned floors. She wasn't the silenced woman hiding from the monster in the mansion. She was now something else entirely, respected by some, envied by others, feared by many. But she didn't care. She didn't return for fame. She returned to reclaim her life. She walked past the old church where she had once hidden, past the market where she begged for Gary, past the alleyway where she had once almost died. And she walked with her head high. She rented a small one-room apartment on the edge of the city. The walls were cracked. The mattress was thin. But it was safe. It was hers. She decorated it with handwritten Bible verses, pictures of her son, and tiny paper butterflies made by neighborhood kids. She began selling handmade soaps and oils at the junction, and within weeks, women lined up not just for the products, but for her strength. "Are you her?" they would ask softly. She would smile and say, "I'm just Amaka." She didn't need to be anything more. The truth had already spoken for her. She fed her son each night with food bought through honesty. And as she watched him sleep on the same mattress that once cradled her tears, she knew this was wealth, peace, safety, dignity. These were riches that Edward would never know. One day, she passed the street where Edward's billboard used to stand, his smiling face advertising a foundation for women. It was gone now, replaced by a poster of a young girl holding a book with the caption, "Let every voice be heard." She smiled, not because she had won, but because she had endured. And sometimes, endurance is the greatest victory of all. She walked home that day under a sky painted in soft orange and blue, her child strapped to her back, the past behind her, the future gently unfolding before her. There were no parades, no headlines, just her breath, her strength, and a journey that began with a slap, but ended with silence broken forever. The rain came softly that evening, falling like whispers on the rooftop of Amaka's small flat. She sat on the floor beside Chikwuti's crib, gently folding laundry and humming a lullaby her mother used to sing. Her hands moved slowly but surely, like someone who had learned to treasure peace, especially the kind that wasn't handed to her, but fought for through blood and tears. Outside, the sounds of the city faded into a quiet evening rhythm. Children playing in the distance, street vendors calling out their final sales, the occasional honk of a kiki. And through it all, Amaka sat grounded in a kind of stillness she never thought possible. She had lost everything and survived. She had been hunted, humiliated, bruised, and broken. But in the end, she had something her abuser would never possess again: truth, peace, and the ability to sleep at night without fear. Edward Kane was gone. The news of his downfall had ceased dominating headlines, replaced by newer scandals and government dramas. He sat alone in a prison holding facility, awaiting multiple trials for not just what he did to Amaka, but what he had done to countless others. The man who once thought himself invincible now lived in shadows, disgraced, forgotten, and stripped of the wealth that once bought silence. But Amaka didn't follow the news anymore. She no longer needed updates about the man who once shaped her nightmares. Her focus was her child, her healing, her future. She planted herbs in her small backyard and sold oils at the local market. She volunteered twice a week at a home for abused girls anonymously, offering hands rather than stories. She didn't want to be anyone's symbol. She just wanted to live a quiet, meaningful life and raise a boy who knew love, not power, as strength. One night, as she rocked Chiquiti to sleep, he reached up with his small hand and touched her cheek. His fingers brushed the scar that remained, a faint one from the night she escaped police custody. Hidden behind the same cheek she once turned when Edward offered his fake apologies. She smiled down at him. "You're my freedom," she whispered. "Not because you were born of pain, but because you proved pain can't have the last word." She kissed his forehead and laid him gently on the mattress. Then she walked outside into the open air, her wrapper tied tight around her waist, the sky now clear and filled with stars. She looked up, letting the night wind hit her face. No more chains. No more fear. Just the sound of her own breath, strong and steady, and the unspoken promise that she would never be silenced again. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel Tochi Stories for more.